All right then, if we're all set to start, unless anybody else thinks they're gonna dash in 2 minutes. I am Amanda Shepp. I am the digital director of the Shepp Museum, located in a not-for-profit center in Amherst, New York. Well, that's where our storage is located. We are physically on the internet. We're a web-only museum, and that's it. We've got about 3,000 physical objects, 300 of which are online in our digital collection. And it's been a little complicated of a path, but it can really help out your small museum as far as getting publicity, as far as getting your name out there and drawing up interest, because a lot of the issues as far as getting people involved tend to be physical location, usually rural stuff, like no one knows about you or where you are, and it's just a happenstance, like, hey, I didn't know this was here. We start by saying, loosely quoted from Futurama, welcome to the world of tomorrow. How many of you are volunteers? Okay. How many of you are professionals? Okay. How many of you have digitized anything before? Ooh, nice. How many of you have a museum with an existing digital collection? Oh, okay. That's okay, it's okay. So why would you digitize a collection? Many reasons. Like I said, you can increase your publicity and your accessibility. It's a chance to partner with larger institutions. Our digital museum essentially started out through the New York Digital Humanities Drive. Essentially, we had one collection that was really interesting and people had a lot of interest in it. It's a collection of snake oil bottles, like alternative medicine, crazy snakeskin soup kind of thing. But we didn't really have any place to put this. We have very limited physical space. About half of our artifacts are just jammed loosely in a storage cabinet with no finding aid whatsoever, and our curator is just dandy with that. I'm slowly working on him. But it's a chance to modernize, it's a chance to get up there and show what you have, especially if you don't have the space to display what you have, all of it. It's a chance to appeal to your younger volunteers, like, hey, you run a blog, you have a Tumblr, why don't you try your hand at doing something more involved with that? You don't have to be an expert. There's a lot of very intense metadata things. There's a lot of very simple metadata things. It's not as arduous to learn as you would think. And it increases your accessibility of your resources and your information. You can keep your audience and your patrons interested through social media updates, like have a Twitter account, like, hey, we just posted this new item to our digital collection, go check it out. Here's a link. You can keep interest drummed up through Facebook. If you're beginning a digital collection, you can sort of get interest drummed up, like be sure to check it out. Hey, 10 days until our digital collection drops, da-da-da. To give you an idea of how it doesn't have to be, this is a day of digitizing for me. Just stuff in a cart, to the basement, to my tiny lab. This is about how it came out of the storage cabinet. This is what was in, this is what it looked like inside cabinet, this is what it looks like going, and this is pretty much how it got put back. So if you don't have the space and you have a lot of cool things, it's a really good idea. It does get you out there, and it does open a lot of doors. After we digitized our snake oil collection, we appeared on an episode of Mysteries at the Museum for said snake oil collection. And then later in the season, they came back and asked us to appear again for a collection of spirit trumpets. So you do get a lot of interesting publicity out of it. So, you got cool stuff? Is your collection really interesting? Do you have pertinent things to your local history or the history of your institution? Is it viable in some way? You don't have to digitize anything or everything. It should have at least one of these qualities. If it has more, that's way better. Your digital collection should say something about your institution as far as your main mission or your main audience. Like, it should appeal to some broad category of people. And there's a lot of ways to get it out there through like search engine notifications, like it can be high up on ranks in Google if you have the right plugins to apply. As far as your institutions, you can increase your donor chances as well. If you have things like a Kickstarter, you can drum up interest like, hey, we're trying to get some software to support this digital collection. You should really think about giving us $25. And you can get a museum membership, and you can get a book, or your name on a little plaque on our website, or a thanks page on the donors list. It would be really interesting to do that stuff. It also can increase your chances to get funds and grants if you've started a digital initiative, which is really helpful. So, before you think about digitizing, you should think about what you have versus what you need. Think about your haves versus your needs in terms of your staff, your equipment, your display goals, your target audience, the potential of your collection, how involved you want your displays to be. Do you want like this big complex collection format, or would you rather have a simple web display like on a Weebly page? All of these concepts kind of shape the parameters of the size and scope and budget that you need to embark on a digital project.
Did you say a Weebly page? What the heck is that?
Weebly is like a simple web hosting forum. It does basically free pages and cheap domain names. So if you don't already have a museum page, or you don't have the space on your museum page, you just can start like digitalcollections.yourmuseumname.com, and then you would have a separate access with much more storage to begin your digital collection. So like host it.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with service, the two that you identify on your slide. It said service and then you listed two.
Oh, I will get to that. Sorry. Yeah, feel free to ask questions at any point. I'm good with that. So you're determining your haves, you should basically be thinking about your skills and your equipment. You should think about how detailed and involved you want your collection to be. You should think about your main and target audience and how much access you want them to have. Are you going to have this on your institution's intranet for your own purposes, or do you want to make it public so anyone and everyone can access your collection? The Skepticeum is a public collection because we basically want to do it for the love of education. We don't really charge access, we don't really have memberships. It's just, here is our collection, take a look at it. And we get a lot of intrigue in scholarly articles and scholarly things. We're basically attached to a small private library that gets a lot of visiting scholars, and because of that attention, we've gotten visiting scholars that come in to look at our physical objects because they have seen them on the internet and know that they are there. So it's a nice way to connect with people and further your institution. Your main audience of in-house, intranet, or consortium, it determines the size and scope, how public or professional you want it to be. Do you want it to just be casual? Do you want super intense 60 lines of metadata describing all sorts of everything? Or do you just want it to be casual and interesting and flashy, essentially? This helps set your needs with your target audience, and it helps set your modes of access. Then you need to think about your metadata requirements as far as how involved and intricate is your digital collection? Do you need someone else to come in and help you repeat it or complete it? Do you need a librarian to help with metadatas and cataloging? How cataloged is your collection? It's complete versus what's not? Do you have very basic minimalistic descriptors? Or do you have like pages and pages and pages per item that you know the complete provenance and history and acquisition history of this item? Do you want your Dublin core, or do you want a more basic schema? Do you want resource description? These are all things that definitely help shape what you're doing. And then when you're getting into that, what sort of training do you need? If you're not satisfied with your level of description and you want more information about each item to be put out there, do you have someone that can do that? Or do you need to outsource and hire a professional? Do you even have a savvy volunteer that could do that? That's sort of how I started. And then you need to think about your copyright and your intellectual property restrictions. Are your items in the public domain? If not, do you own the rights to them? Can you own the rights to them? Can you ask permission? Do you want to offer your images to the public for download purposes, or hey, I need this image for this project that I'm doing and I used your museum collection as a source. Can I use this picture in my project? Things like that definitely come up way more often than you'd think with a digital collection. Then depending on your copyright restrictions, in your metadata you should have notes about whether or not people can use these, whether or not these are for public usage, links to them. If you want to be credited, you should have a accreditation statement in there, just image courtesy of your institution and blah. If they're lengthy or written ambiguously, in my history, they tend to get chopped by whoever the end user is, so you might not always get the proper accreditation, so be sure that you explicitly state it. And then also, do you have staff members that can write copyright statements? Do you know someone that has the legalese ability for this? Next, I wanted to talk about the equipment that you might need. What's your collection's focus? How large is it? Do you have mostly flat 2D items, or do you have 3D physical objects? Because those are different processes with different equipments. As far as cameras and scanners go, you don't exactly need like ultra mega top of the line, but it would be very nice if you had something that could create an art level quality TIFF. That's essentially what you're looking for. As far as a camera, do you have a place to take these pictures? Do you have a secluded little office that you can hide in, or are you limited on that? Do you have access to a photographer? Think about your volunteers. Do you have some interesting art student that likes to take pictures or considers themselves a photographer? That's a very cheap way to get your photography handled. You also need to think about, as far as your equipment, how much permanent online storage do you need? How large are these images going to be, and how does that affect your institution's intranet network as far as where you are putting these things? Do you have access to this equipment finally? If not, do you have the budget to acquire some of this equipment? Do you have like a volunteer or a member of your staff that just got like a fancy new camera or an awesome new scanner? Ask them if you can use it. It helps.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
In terms of audience, how much foundational planning should you do from the outset? So for example, if you know that you're going to do an internal database collection, but at some point you want to do an online exhibit, should you look at something like Omeka that can do both? Or think about it incrementally and only focus on each particular project at that particular time?
If it's a thing that you're looking for an in-house at first that you would eventually like to make public, it is useful to think about those transitions, because generally the softwares that you need are slightly different.
Right.
So something like Omeka that provides a transition is a really good choice, and also it's a really good choice for a smaller institution's budget, because they're not ridiculously expensive. They have several free platforms, which is what we're using now, and it's delightful. You don't need something as intense as Content DM.
Right.
So,
It's expensive.
yeah. Does that about do it? As far as what I'm talking about with metadata, this is Content DM level metadata. You've got all of your elements, and it continues until about here, if you're looking at the actual spreadsheet. This was all I could fit in a screenshot. But it does get insanely intense as far as some of those things go. So this is an important factor. How much do you know about your items? Is half of your collection stuff that was like left in a box on your porch or given to you by anonymous donors that you have no idea what it is or where it came from? Because that's my collection. Our curator is an antiques madman, so he tends to buy really hot deals that he has no idea what they are. And then I get to research them. Okay, so Software and systems, now that you've figured out your level of audience and necessary equipment and ownership over the rights to your items, how do you want to display it? Do you want to do a website or a gallery style site, or do you want like a rich interactive exhibit? There's a lot of really interesting, cool, upcoming technology and versions of displays to do this. And there's a lot of free and low cost options, which is pretty sweet. As far as your open source stuff, which is basically free, it's more often than not free, and it's stuff that is often contributed to by basically anyone with technological skills. Like, hey, I made this sweet plugin that does Google Maps, so if you have a digital collection of items from a widespread area of things, you can geotag those things and show on a virtual map where all of your items came from. And that's kind of cool. Just might be me being a nerd, but I think it's cool. So open source things are usually the better choice for small museums. They tend to be more user-friendly. You can modify them with a lot of plugins, and there's a variety of templates that you can start off with, so it's not just all, oh yeah, that was done with that, and it all looks the same. You have a lot of variety, and you can really make these your own. Most of them, you learn how to do them on your own. There's not really an official training or an official manual for a lot of these, so it's hunting in forums and how savvy you are with communicating with the developers, which are usually very open to communication and very willing to help you, especially if you're new. They're really nice people, especially the people at Omeka. They're wonderful. It's fairly easy to create and manage your content. You get like a really robust choice of narratives and layouts. Good for beginners. You can make more complex with plugins. So let's talk about Omeka, which is what I use and what I've been asked about, and apparently it's familiar, so good, hooray. You can get a lot of plugins for it. You can do a Google Maps geocaching thing like I just mentioned. There's also options to apply Library of Congress subject headings to everything. There's also a really cool plugin called Neatline, where if your things are physically laid out in a space, you essentially mock up the plans of your floor layout, and you can take a virtual tour of, oh, this is in this room, there's that painting, there's this, here's this sculpture, oh my, and then here's the next room. And it's a very, really excellent way of laying out your museum in a physical space so that people who can't necessarily get to that physical space can still experience it in the way that you've intended them to.
Could you repeat the name of that
Hmm?
plugin that you're just
Neatline. Neatline. Omeka lets you create rich exhibits with a lot of customizable plugins. A lot of these things aren't just a standard thing that just, oh, that's what it does. You can tweak a lot of it and make everything your own in a lot of very deep ways. You can support search engines like Google. There's a ton of cataloging possibilities. You don't just have to have one metadata format. It's very accepting of a lot of things. It's also really nice to upload. They support CSV and XML spreadsheets and CSS. You can get a lot more intense with them if you know some programming languages like CSS or SQL or HTML5. I don't know that much about them. I'm learning. But yeah, Omeka's pretty swell. As far as, there's another one called Collective Access. Their focus is mainly on cataloging and web page displays. So it's a lot more for organizing, indexing, and displaying your collections swiftly. Open Exhibit is another one. Their focus is on multi-touch interactive exhibits, like things you would use on a touchpad or an iPad kind of thing, where you can pinch and drag to view items, you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can rotate the item in a 3D viewing thing so you can see all perspectives of it, which a lot more scholars need to do. And therefore, this is for use mainly with existing digital objects. So if it's a thing that you have already digitized, this is a service you can go to enhance your digital collection. It's not necessarily a primary display mode. Ad Museum is another one. The light version is free. They do have a more intense paid version that's not super expensive. Their focus is on data management. They're mostly for people that have less than 5,000 objects in their museum. So they're pretty nice. They have a graphic interface with module add-ons, so it's sort of like if any of you have ever used Blogger or WordPress, it's that click and drag and rearrange it in your own frame kind of way. So you don't need to know the formatting in HTML and this needs to be over here and pound that. You don't need to do all that. They also have mobile collection management for your institution. It's an app on your phone. You scan the object with an RFID code or a barcode, and that allows you to keep a database within the app of what you have and where it is. So it helps your display, it helps your storage, it helps you keep sane. And also, Ad Museum is used by over 1,600 museums in 25 countries. So they have a lot of multilingual input, they have special characters. I believe they do use Hebrew characters. And their smallest client is a one-man operation, and then their largest one is the National Museum of Ireland. So they're variegated as far as your needs goes. Pachyderm is another one from the New Media Consortium. Its focus is on beginners and people that don't have that much tech experience. Basically, if you can fill out a form on a web page, you can make a digital collection with this. They have a lot of pre-designed things. You can get a little fancier if you know a little bit more about what you're plugging into these forms. But your end result is going to be a flash-based, so it's going to move and look cool, interactive multimedia exhibits. So if you have an interesting wardrobe piece or something, you can analyze the elements of it and take a look at it in different directions and like, what would you like and what would you look like in this outfit, and do something like that. It's mostly focused on image, audios, and videos. So if these are your primary things, like if you have two-dimensional objects or a lot of audio or oral histories, this is for you. If you are more comfortable or more experienced, or you have more complex collection needs or audience needs or a larger display, or you're hooked up with a larger consortium, you might want to try some more thorough things like Content DM. This is if you have the budget for it as well. It does get a little costly. Their focus is on cataloging and exhibits and driving the people that input their information crazy. They're a proprietary application from OCLC. They upload, description, and management and access your images. That is their main focus, is creating this thing from the ground up and then displaying it with their format, but it's not as customizable. Their end result is pretty much set in stone before you get to it. There's not a lot of options that you have as far as making it your own. So it's nice if you have a lot of intense work to do or you have a lot of skills to put into it, but if you really want something that's yours and feels like yours, maybe start with one of the other ones. Oh wait, there's also services if you feel completely overwhelmed by any possibility of digitizing anything. Canto by Cumulus and Lyrasis are both services where you can send them your items and then they do all the digitizing work for you and send you back the digital content. But that is also slightly costly.
If you've got something you've done in Omeka, say, and then you get something else in, I don't know if this is, I don't know if I'm speaking correctly here. You get somebody else's materials and Ad Museum, can you transport from one to another easily, or do you have to start over?
That sort of depends. Generally, if you have an existing digital object, it's fairly simple to just give up on one system and then upload it into another. The major problem with that is usually the metadata, because different systems have different requirements. Some things have their own proprietary metadatas, like Content DM has about 10 subjects within metadata that are strictly for the use of Content DM, and that's it. So some of it can get a little hair pulling. But otherwise, it's generally easy as long as you have the digital image, you have the rights to the image, and you basically know the start of your metadata, and you can clip it according to your needs.
I have probably a really stupid question, and I apologize, well,
There are no stupid
Okay.
questions.
we have a lot of our stuff digitized already and put on Past Perfect as our collection management. How does that interact with this, or can it interact with this?
Some of it can, as far as Past Perfect goes. I'm not ultra familiar with how that one in particular works. I have a lot of experience with library-oriented things that can also apply to museums. But from what I've heard, Past Perfect is a little complicated to work with as far as putting your media into it. But I think that would be better left to ask them as far as transitions go. But generally, if you have the images and stuff, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. I heard you, I'm sorry.
Yes, I can answer that question actually, because we're already doing that exact thing.
Hooray!
So Past Perfect, they have an option to interface digitally, but because they're not cloud-based, so because you can't actually store the information on the cloud, you have to create a separate plugin on your website that Past Perfect designs for you in order to get it to be uploaded online. So you can actually get it online, it's just you're limited to whatever they designed for you, and it's not particularly customizable. If you're looking to move from Past Perfect, a really easy alternative is something called digitize, which is an open source online database, and you can actually export a file really easily out of Past Perfect and just move it into their spreadsheet, and it will actually import it for you, and it's free. And they can import it for $120 for 10,000 objects or less. So that's a really easy way if you want a more customizable format. Otherwise, you can work with Past Perfect to use their actual proprietary software to use.
Since I work for Past Perfect, I'll speak.
Sorry if I misrepresented.
That's right. It happens all the time. Past Perfect stores your images, your digital content in the file forms that they are. It's, you can consider it open source. You save it as a TIFF, you save it as a JPEG, it's in the database as a JPEG or a TIFF. But where it has a lot more than a lot of these metadata standards is these metadata standards are based on a really finite number of fields. It's not what the appraisal value is, the purchase value, and all of those other fields that Past Perfect is keeping for you. But we can then take that, which if you think about it as, well, let's call it something from Star Wars, the huge Death Star. Not that it's dead, but this huge thing, we could send out the piece that you need to go to one of these systems, so that rather than managing the data in Amica, we can get the data and the image content to Amica so that you can then display. So if you don't want to use Past Perfect Online, which is told as our proprietary hosted thing, there are other alternatives. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Advice. Whether you're using Past Perfect or you're already using one of the other solutions, IO or whatever these are. There's ways to talk between these devices to use them for what they're good for. Because I don't think anyone is proclaiming that Amica is a great collections management software. Is that true?
It's, as far as management, it's a little hairy. You sort of have to keep your own records with things.
Sure. It doesn't have an accession process.
But
You
it's
go
lovely
through
for display.
Exactly. So using each one of these tools for their intended purpose is, I think, the best way to do it.
No, agreed. As far as Amiga goes, this is an example of what you do with item creation and things like that. You've got simple pages, you can build things, your LC subject headings, you can do simple vocab, or simple vocab is like your tagging system, so you can make it internet searchable by Google and things like that. You can use Dropbox to store all of your images and your metadata, which is awesome. From your CSV import, collection tree is a nice way of hierarchically organizing your exhibit before you do anything to it. And then as far as your collections, your item types, you can do double and core, where you can edit the facets for it and edit what you are needing in your metadata. You can change what the item type of the metadata is, and then this is all of your Dropbox files and how you connect them to your items. So, now that you have a better idea what goes into it, this is how you figure out the balance of your elements. It's essentially equipment times staff times budget to make it very condensed and very simplified. Your equipment is pretty straightforward. It's what you have versus what you don't. The ability to use it is a factor. Do you have someone that has the capacity to scan? Do you have someone that can take decent pictures? Do you have someone that can manage these files once they're created? That is a problem I have run into way more than once. And then do you have the budget to update your equipment or get new equipment if you don't have these things? Staff is another factor. Do you have knowledgeable staff? Do you have volunteers? Do you have someone that can take your photos? Do you have someone that can handle these things in a professional manner that can do this stuff? Their skill level kind of hinges on the intricacy of your digital project. As far as describing items, do you need subject experts? Do you need tech experts or professionals to deal with this? Do you have the full capacity to describe your items? And then your budget, your availability of your funding. How much do you need? Do you need a ton of new things? Do you need a ton of new equipment? Do you feel that you need to build a fancy tiny photo booth? Or can you just kind of work with what you have? How much of your collection do you want to digitize? If you've got 3,000 things like we do, you will never be able to digitize all of them in an efficient manner that's cost effective. I mean, you can if you have a troop of large, loving volunteers, but we're a three-man operation. We have 2 staff members and my lovely husband volunteer, and that's what we're working with. So we have a very limited amount of staff, and our curator is not the most tech-savvy dude on the planet. He has a Twitter account that he operates by writing 5 tweets at a time on a piece of legal paper and then handing them to me. So this is what I'm working with. As you can see, he's rubbed off on me with these note cards. So as far as your budget goes, how do you want to digitize them? Is everything really necessary to digitize? If you have 5 of a similar item, do all 5 of those make the point that you need to make? Or is one of them really significant or better? These are things that ought to be considered because you don't want to necessarily flood your digital collection with a lot of things that people aren't going to be super interested in, unless that is the drive of your museum. Or if you've only got 150 things, maybe you might want to make them all available, especially if they're super interesting. And then the final aspect of it is how to show it. What sort of display method do you want? Like I mentioned with the software before, do you want it to be insanely complicated where you might have to pay for a premium display option? Or do you just want a simple web page that's like a picture gallery? So all of this kind of determines the size and scope of your digital project. What software you need, how long you need to complete it, your cataloging level and your metadata, and how much funding you need.
What sort of image size do you typically use?
Generally for display purposes, we like to use archival TIFFs for having as far as institutionalized, but usually web display, unless you can properly resize and reformat all of them, your website gets really cumbersome and really slow to load. So using a JPEG for display is a nicer, more user-friendly way to do it, but you can also make the point of, we have an archival TIFF if you need it. Like, do you need this for your paper? Do you need this for a display? Are you more interested in taking a more thorough look at this image? We have that image for you. It's here. You can also put a link to it down below.
When you say it's, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
when you say it's here, are you saying it's also available from the website, stored, accessible to the web? It's web stored?
Yeah.
Because these things can be hundreds of megabytes and even
Oh yeah.
in the gigabytes now.
Yep. Most of our images are just ridiculous, which is why we've taken the option of just displaying JPEGs and keeping our archival TIFFs in a separate area that's not necessarily on the web. And we would prefer it if they contacted our webmaster, which is to get a hold of an archival TIFF if it's something that they really need to take a closer look at.
Are you saying it is still on a web server, or are you keeping it in-house?
We're keeping it in-house for the moment. Eventually, when we get the network space cleared up, we're having fun with Blackbaud at the moment. Networking, storage systems, another hair-pulling venture. But you can have them there. There's also fun things on Omega, like a zoom-in viewer, where if you have a high-quality image, you can look at that in ridiculously zoomed-in quality to take a really, really close look at items, even closer than you could in person.
I've been taking pictures of cemetery stones, and basically for the JPEG, we created JPEG at 5x7 size at 300 bits per inch, and then we also created a TIFF. Is that standard, or is that?
Generally, yeah. What we do as far as our standards is we take a digital image and get the raw data from it and convert the raw data into our archival TIFF. And when the raw data is created, there's usually also a JPEG for a thumbnail reference type thing.
Okay.
And the JPEG is usually what gets displayed on our site, so that way they know that it's there, and if they need to access a closer look to it, they have that capacity.
Why do you prefer JPEGs to PNGs?
PNGs, as far as Omeka goes, specifically like with what I am working with now, do not work the way I want them to. They tend to load very wonky or blurry or fuzzy, and they're not exactly super compatible with a lot of these image uploading things because they're sort of newish. But if you're trying to do something like a mobile display, oh yeah, that's what you want. Does that take care of it? So I got some tips for you so you don't get overwhelmed, because there are some things to keep in mind that could help when things are looking fairly impossible. So this is how I outlined our digital museum. I was basically given a printout of an existing picture gallery website. I received about 400 Xerox pages of web pages with all of the information that we have currently, and I am in the process of converting it to a massive digital display. This involved a lot of recategorizing, reindexing, retypifying, because you would get things like this collection that only has 6 items, and then this collection that has like 30. And some of the issues overlap, some of the categories overlap, and then you resort to things like the Library of Congress subject headings to determine really what is where, as far as technical terms that your metadata is going by. But there's no real wrong way to do with this, except to not, I guess. But this is all also determined about how you want your digital display to look. Do you want it to be a narrative, or do you just want, hey, here's all my stuff? Or are you trying to tell a story with your display? Is each exhibit its own point? Is it its own function? Or does it all just have elements to contribute to a larger massive message? You should also think about the flow of your items in your digital collection. Because our museum does not have a physical space, and probably never will, we've had to take the liberty of arranging these exhibits and halls in walk-through order. So you walk in, and then here's your introduction to where you are, the space that you're in, and then, hey, over here is the Hall of Cryptozoology, and over here is the Hall of Alternative Medicine. And they sort of relate in topic as you go through, so you're not just looking at, hey, it's over there, it's over there, it's over there, it's over there. So you can have a legitimate walk-through museum experience where everything connects. This is where I took all my photos from my digitization. I hid in the archives room and made it myself. But it still ends up taking lovely professional quality photos. So you don't really need, if you think you need this beautiful, gorgeous professional photo space, you don't. If you have the skills to create the same end result, it will work for you. If you don't have a ton of space or a ton of professionals or a ton of materials, you can kind of get around that yourself using do-it-yourself initiative. Do you know a photography student, like I mentioned before? Do they want some portfolio opportunities? Then get them in. And don't be afraid to be creative, really. It's more fun that way. Don't panic over obstacles. So, this is my cat. This is my work. This is what my cat does when she has determined I have worked too much. It's easy to be overwhelmed, especially with new projects and new technology. When I first started this project and was given this opportunity, I knew zero things about Omeka. I had only worked with Content DM, which is very particular. I had no idea. There's not exactly a training manual on Omeka. When I walked in to talk to our library director about this, he said, well, you set up the Omeka account, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, good, that makes you the expert. So it is a little overwhelming and terrifying at times when you have small issues that you have zero idea how to correct. But if you just stick to it and work through your issues, and you can have the ability to step back and take a look at them without freaking out, it will work for you. It's going to be okay, I swear. Don't be afraid of a challenge. So if I haven't scared you off yet, there are ways to fund these things. Once you figured out the scale and size of your digital project and what your needs are to complete it, as far as technology, staffing, training, etc., you may need to think about additional funding options. And there's a lot of options that are available on a smaller and larger scale. As far as your federal grants go, the Institute of Museum and Library Services does a lot of interesting little grants. This one I know is closed for the year, but they do take applications, I think, yearly. The IMLS Museums for America grant, their goal is to strengthen museums for lifelong learning and community importance. And their grants do cover things like training, collection, conservation, and preservation, increasing public access and technology. The National Endowment for the Humanities does a few things. They do preservation assistant grants for smaller institutions, the goal of which is presenting and planning, or preservation planning activities for smaller institutions. It's not really for digitizing, but if you want to train someone to digitize, this is definitely an option. They also do digital humanities startup grants, which are kind of nice. The goal of which is to benefit digital humanities institutions and provide innovative technology uses for public programming and education. Yeah.
Just so I don't forget, are you okay with making your presentation available to us?
Oh yeah. This is going to be, well, it is now on Prezi.com. It's a cloud-based presentation service. That's why it's all fancy and moving. But this will be up, it will be on my LinkedIn as well. You should be able to find it through a Google search of my name. If you do want a personal copy, I have cards up here by the projector. Just email me and I will be happy to send you a link.
Thank you.
No problem. There's also things like the National Historic Publications and Records Commission. Their focus is on historical documents and records. They're digitizing historical records grant, the deadline of which is in June of this year. Their goal is primarily digitizing online copies, and using existing complete collections to make them accessible to the public. They want to essentially digitize copies of important and historically significant records, so it's primarily for archival things. And then they also do the Decoding Democracy Access to Historical Records project, the goal of which is to facilitate and enhance access to primary source materials. They want to establish archival projects, digitizing it online, the placement of archival finding aids, and processing archival collections. So it's a pretty rich thing, and it's cool. Also, your National Historic Preservation offices can help you in finding and hooking you up with smaller grants. They can help with larger grants and additional funding, and they're also a good place to look for a possible collaboration opportunity if they're interested in partnering and promoting your institution and they have a little bit more funding to get you both the publicity through this. For private funding, the Knight Foundation is a very tech-driven, artsy foundation. They bring small communities together with open information. They're really driven through tech and engagement. They have a ton of really interesting, really individualized grants, so I would absolutely suggest looking into them. The Alfred P. Sloan Foundation is focused on science and technology. Their grants are a lot of science and technology. They have a digital information technology grants that works with the Digital Public Library of America. They're trying to get universal access to knowledge and make humanities resources very, very public and very, very open and very, very clear. Also, the Mellon Foundation, their focus is on supporting preservation and access and increasing public access and humanities information. They do a lot with scholarly communications and information technology. And also, the American Alliance of Museums does a lot of interesting grants. Archives.com offers $1,000 grants to smaller institutions for digitizing and making available local history collections, which is an interesting way to go. And also Kickstarter, which is the most underappreciated thing ever. It's a really great way to do crowdsourcing and creative funding. You can appeal to a very wide audience. There have been a few studies done on this recently with smaller institutions giving incentives like books, donor plates, museum memberships, and higher incentives like if you donated $200, you got an invitation to a private fundraiser appreciation gala, which encourages you to do more with the museum, because once you get a higher tier donation, you also get the lower tier donations. So you have members that are interested, that are funded, that are educated, and it keeps them coming back and keeps them involved. So, finally, here's your checklist for your digital projects. Do you have significant materials? Do they conform to the mission of your institution? Are they particularly fragile or rare or valuable? Will digitizing them increase their usage without increasing their usage? Does it get them seen without being handled? They don't have to put up with the strenuous limitations of display and UV damage and things like that. Does anyone possibly have a duplicate of any of these items? If so, you may want to rethink digitizing them. Do you have permission for these items? Do you have clearance? Are they in the public domain? Do you own them? As far as your metadata, what needs to be described? What is completed? What has been described? Are these descriptions going to be useful to your end users? That's essentially what you're looking for, is your end user needs to be happy. Do you want to, does your description enhance the intellectual access and authenticity of your items? Will digitizing this item risk intellectual control over it? You need to have your conditions of terms and use laid out in your metadata, like I said earlier about copyright statements and reuse statements for images. If they can download these images, what are you going to do if someone alters them? Like, how will you deal with that? As far as your research value of your items, is it going to be frequently used, do you think? Will it add value to this item if you digitize it? Does it have potential for collaborative value? Think about the lifespan of these digital objects. How can you keep them current? How will you keep your collection updated? Do you want to have access to multiple platforms with this? How interoperable are these? Like we were mentioning with Past Perfect versus other programs and how they can mesh. And then your resources. Do you have funding versus time? And also, do you have an estimated cost per image? Because most places do need to know that if you're applying for grants or help. So if you are interested, technology is changing the expectations of museum audiences. They expect to be able to see these items outside of your museum. They expect to be able to look at these items more intimately than they would in your museum. They want to know everything that they can. Digital collections can offer a lot, and they can open the door to make new patrons, to make new donors, to get new collaborations. There's a lot of interesting new possibilities as far as mobile phone apps and augmented reality and really cool things that you can do with your phone. Also, digital collections are a way to break down barriers of disability. If you don't have physical access that's available to everybody, this can help. Do you have blind patrons that come in? They can see some of your items via augmented reality apps. It's a very interesting way to keep your audience connected. And if you're interested in looking at any of this stuff further, Museum 2.0 is a blog that's run by a lady called Nina Simon. She's really awesome. And she has a lot of very interesting ideas about Kickstarter and crowdsourcing and modernizing a small museum. New Media Consortium. They are a community of universities and colleges that try and get stats and updates and news and seminars out about keeping your museum modern and digitizing and what you can do with it. And also the Center for the Future of Museums from the American Alliance of Museums is pretty sweet. They monitor museum trends and connect museums to prepare for coming challenges and changes. So, that is your whirlwind trip through digital collections. Any further questions?
How do you deal with watermarking and identification on the image, or do you not?
We used to watermark our images, and we have found that that limits their use. So we tend to just keep explicit copyright statements, and that's why.
It's near the image.
Yeah, it's near the image, and that way if we have someone that needs the higher quality, we can give that to them. But as far as image usage on the website, that's why we keep the JPEG, so it's smaller and watermarked and viewable.
I just want to let you know, I did not have evaluation forms to give to you, to give Amanda feedback. So if you would write a note, Allison wasn't able to find them, I guess. You could write a note and put them at the desk so we can give Amanda feedback.
That would be fine.
It'd be greatly appreciated.
All right.
So do you charge people for the higher res images?
Not really, no. Because our higher res images are mostly done by scholarly sources, and especially international scholarly sources, it tends to be a complicated thing that we don't really like to do.
To get into.
But it is an
how
option.
Someone won't take your images and then use them for profit.
Generally, people are pretty cool about asking for stuff like that. Like there was a girl that was designing a set of tarot cards, and we have a Gypsies and Fortune Tellers exhibit, and she wanted to use some of our images for that. Because she was making them herself and it was independent, we only asked that she gave us credit for the use of the images in her deck of cards. Like in the instructions, just be sure to note that the images came from us, and on good faith, she actually sent us a deck of the cards to prove that she had done that.
So it benefits you because of the additional exposure,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, so.
Yep, we're basically looking for, any exposure is good exposure, is sort of what we're going for. Our curator is one of those talking head types for television, so that's sort of his motto is, no exposure is the worst kind of exposure. Anybody else? Are we all set?